In the morning, we heard from Will Wynne, who cast a Texan eye on sustainability and what he has been able to achieve in Austin. Then in the afternoon, Dr. Sarah Miller shared her experiences in the successful implementation of the Ballymun Rediscovery Centres project and the specific challenges they faced in this regeneration and environmental project with significant help from the EU. Now, I'm absolutely delighted today to be joined by MEP Barry Andrews, together with Ambassador Ralph Victory, who will introduce Barry and this morning, and also I think as a general word of introduction. But before I pass the baton to you, Ambassador, I just want to remind everyone who has logged in that this afternoon we have a session at 4 p.m. with the Minister of State for Financial Service, Credit Unions and Insurance, Sean Fleming. I would welcome and very much encourage everyone to tune into that as well. So thank you initially, huge thanks to both Barry and to Ambassador Ralph Victory for joining us today. I think it's going to be a very interesting session. Thank you. Over to you, Ambassador.
Thank you very much, Jeffrey. Good morning. And Bannington Law Félig Pádraig, Díomh Galéir, Feliz Dia de San Patricio. Happy St. Patrick's Day to everybody. Delighted to be here, delighted to be joining you for today, this morning's session. Following on, as you said, Jeffrey, those that took place yesterday, which I believe were very successful. If I may extend a particular Céad Míle Fáilte and buíochas to MEP Barry Andrews. Delighted, Mr. Andrews, that you're able to join us this morning. You are, of course, former Minister for Children and Youth Affairs, CEO of Goal Humanitarian Agency, and Director General of the Institute for International and European Affairs, which is where you and I would have last crossed paths prior to my own becoming ambassador here. So delighted. Thank you very much indeed for taking time out of your day to join us on this special day. But as we were saying beforehand, it's also a working day. So we very much appreciate your availability. These days you are, of course, MEP for Dublin region. And if I may say, just to underline just the importance of the role of the European Parliament, particularly as regards issues around Brexit. The European Parliament is, of course, very much the co-decision maker in the overall EU architecture, along with the Council of Member States. So very welcome that we're getting your own perspective, getting a European Parliament perspective on the issues for discussion this morning. So thank you so much once again for joining us. Thank you, Jeffrey, and I'll leave it back to you. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Ambassador. Now, Mr. Andrews, I'm going to kind of dive in right in there, really, maybe a little bit at the beginning, and looking at a little bit at your career evolution and what drove you to an agenda focusing on a more sustainable Europe, which of course we can't really detach from a more sustainable world. So what actually attracted you to that space, if you like, Mr. Andrews, initially?
Well, good morning, Jeffrey, and I hope you call me Barry if it's all the same with you. Well, we're together, you know, we have this conversation. Looking forward to it very much, and I want to wish everybody a happy St. Patrick's Day, and my thoughts particularly with people who are unable to get home at the moment, either Portuguese trying to get home or Irish trying to get home. It's a very difficult time to be separated from loved ones. So very much want to, on this St. Patrick's Day, really make that point. Maybe it's more like a St. Patrick's Day 50 years ago or 100 years ago, where we think of loved ones that we can't see and can't get to see in the normal way. So delighted to be here and to engage with your members. In terms of my own journey towards this area of interest, it's really, I suppose, it's been a feature of my career from the very beginning. I was a member of Greenpeace as a young, enthusiastic, idealistic school teacher in my 20s, and I was a member of the Dublin cycling campaign, you know, doing small things like that before getting into representative politics. And I was a member of the Irish Parliament for 10 years, and we were very much involved in the Millennium Development Goals as they were from 2000 onwards, and promoting those in the Irish Parliament. Later, as the ambassador just mentioned, I was CEO of Goal. And in that role, there were a number of crises happening in the world. And the common thread, I think, was climate and what was happening on the question of the impact of climate change, whether it was the crisis in Syria, which had been sparked by protests around the impact of water resources, or the Ebola crisis in Sierra Leone, in fact, which was attributed to a certain extent to a loss of biodiversity and the jump of what's called, we all know what zoonotic diseases are now, but back then we were really reflecting on that. So there was a common thread, and it also was impacting the migration crisis, what we now call climate refugees. So that was what was binding it all together, and it was very exciting mid-2015 to see the Paris Climate Agreement begin to come together. So there were these crises happening in the world. It was very clear that that was what was bringing them together, and these very exciting statement of the Sustainable Development Goals in 2015 and the Paris Climate Agreement in 2015. So a huge amount of momentum was brought into the sustainability agenda. So since getting elected to the European Parliament, it's incredible to note how prominent sustainability is on the agenda of every EU institution, whether it's the European Central Bank, the European Investment Bank, the European Parliament itself, the Commission. And for my part, I'm delighted to have been invited to chair the Parliamentarians for the Global Goals, which is has emerged as a new working group here in the European Parliament. So I'm delighted to use my experience to chair that group. There's a similar group in every parliament across Europe. So this is a new step for the European Parliament to have a working group on the global goals. And it is significant for Ireland because I'll just finish on this, Jeffrey, because one of our great diplomats, David Donoghue, guided the Sustainable Development Goals when he was the Irish ambassador to the UN in the mid-2010s. So it has an Irish complexion to it. And so the small role that I would play chairing that group is something that I'm very much looking forward to for the rest of the mandate up to 2024.
No, congratulations, Barry, as well, and on that appointment. I think yesterday it was interesting, talking of climate change, it was interesting to hear a kind of a US view that the average Europeans' carbon footprint was much less than the average Americans. So, I mean, you mentioned the Paris Agreement. Did you see anything other things specifically, which the EU has been able to achieve in terms of towards fighting climate change so far?
Oh yeah, really. I mean, I'm astonished by it. You know, certainly when I ran for election in May 2019, it was a huge issue on the doorsteps with voters. They wanted to see a response by the European Commission and the EU institutions to reflect their anxieties. There was a very strong vote for Green candidates in Ireland, for example, with Greens elected in 2 of the constituencies and almost in the 3rd. And I think this was common throughout Europe. And we'll see in elections, federal elections in Germany in September, and the anticipation is the Greens will do extremely well. And they've done well in regional elections over the last week or so. And that's been reflected in policy. So, for example, the European Parliament led the drive for the debt to be created at a European level. This is a big deal. The European Union is borrowing to fund new programs to help recovery. It's called the Recovery and Resilience Facility. And that has to be applied to green programs and green projects to a very large extent, at 37% of the RRF. And not only is it a massive breakthrough in terms of mutualizing debt at the European level, but then applying the expenditure to sustainability projects to the new Green Deal agenda is incredibly exciting. And as I mentioned earlier, the European Investment Bank has altered its purpose to include a mandate for sustainability in achieving the new Green Deal, and the European Central Bank also. So the European Central Bank used to have its only role is to control inflation, but now it's also to promote the projects that the European Commission has seen as crucial to its strategy over the next few years. So there are other measures. The carbon border adjustment mechanism is a proposal right now, but it would try to address the question of carbon leakage. In other words, if we're getting all of our supplies from countries that don't apply the same rigorous standards around sustainability, are we really contributing through our consumption? So that's what that's trying to address. I happen to be rapporteur on a file on the environmental goods agreement, that is to provide much better tariff preferences for goods that are providing for the environmental agenda. I mean, there's in the trade area, we might want to talk about that a little bit later, Jeffrey, but yep. There's more happening there. There's a really quite a very busy agenda on the sustainability front. And of course, the targets we all know about, to try to reach 55% reduction over 1990 levels by 2030. That's a big deal, and carbon neutrality by 2050. So they're all very ambitious. And now I think as Portugal takes up the presidency, well, it's well into its presidency now, I think Portugal are focused very much on delivery. All of the instruments have been put in place. Now it's about implementation and delivery.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I know that's something in terms of trade is something which is close to your heart. But before we maybe turn on to that, I just wanted to ask about, in the context of the pandemic, I suppose, and the challenges faced by it. The EU needs a new industrial strategy, and it needs to remain open and competitive market to support recovery. But open doesn't necessarily mean defenseless, does it? I mean, how is the search for this balance challenged policy making in this respect? And on the basis that this can be achieved, how do you foresee it happen insofar as that's foreseeable?
Well, it's a great question. And the key word in the question is balance. And in fact, we're preparing a trade policy paper in my group. There's about 100 MEPs in the Renew Europe group. We're kind of in the center of the political spectrum, if you like. And I proposed the title of it to be The Balance of Trade, you know, sort of drawing on the idea of trade balances. And there is a balance to be struck between, on the one hand, the openness for a global trading economy like Ireland, while also protecting our values that we've just been talking about, to try to promote a sustainability agenda, to try to promote human rights and good labor standards around the world, avoiding carbon leakage. How do we strike that balance? So the phrase that we've come up with in the trade world is open strategic autonomy. And it sounds a little bit like an oxymoron. How could you be both open where you accept a rules-based global trading order, you know, based on WTO rules, while at the same time being autonomous, which means setting your own rules. But that is the balance that we're trying to achieve. And it's also a geostrategic balance, because America is you know, a very important trading partner, but as we saw over the last 4 years, not necessarily the most reliable in terms of where its political direction is. It might have changed presidency, but America hasn't ultimately changed. And President Biden has launched a Buy America campaign, which is really a bit of a worry. And on the other hand, China, which is such, you know, the emerging economic and political power. And how do we find the space to develop our own strategic direction between China and the US? So again, it's a balance. But we are developing, sorry, I'll just finish on one last point, which is that last month, the Commission published a trade policy review communication. And in it, they talked about openness, sustainability, and assertiveness. So as openness is anti-protectionism. Now we have to look at our industrial policy and decide whether or not the elements in that amount to protectionism. But assertiveness means being the idea that we will be open where we can and assertive where we must. So we have to provide for defense against things like foreign subsidies from state-owned enterprises getting involved in public procurement, or the acquisition of assets in Europe from outside the EU. But also we have to make sure that we recognize problems like technology transfer. that are occurring in certain geographies to the detriment of EU companies. So there's that balance constantly has to be struck. But I believe that, and I very much am confident that the new trade commissioner, who replaced the Irish trade commissioner, unfortunately, but the new trade commissioner does really want to get that balance right. And I'm happy that he reflected certainly Renew Europe's priorities in the communication.
Okay, no, it's certainly interesting. And actually you mentioned about open trading economy and an open trading economy like Ireland, which you've previously supported the view that trade will help recovery. But it's also a opportunity, or if you like, a unique opportunity to craft new sustainable trade rules that fit with our Green Deal, which you've mentioned. Now, this chimes a little bit with the second line of action of priorities. Now, I also mentioned the Portuguese presidency to the EU Council. And one of those lines of action is a Green Europe, promoting Europe as a leader. And then, you mentioned the US and China. And I guess there's definitely an opportunity there for Europe to be a leader in climate action, implementing the Green Deal and also sustainable economic recovery. Now, sort of looking at it more specifically at Portugal and Ireland, and the sort of overview that you can see, and actually the more particularities which you can see as well. How do you think they are doing in terms of successfully pursuing sustainable trade rules, Barry?
Yeah, I think both, Ireland and Portugal share an affinity based on, I suppose, physically we're maritime countries. We're next to rather larger neighbours, and there are commonalities in terms of our approach on certain issues. And I think increasingly on the issue of on Brexit, of course, because there were very particular issues around Portugal's relationship with the UK, and I remember the chairman of the IEA always emphasising how Portugal's exports of sherry to the UK were very particular, and there was perhaps not the same demand for that product outside Portugal, except for in the UK. So there was a great anxiety to make sure that there was a tariff-free and quota-free agreement. So that was something that we would have shared with Portugal. But on the sustainability agenda, Portugal is very ambitious and supported the 55% reduction by 2030. Portugal's presidency emphasizes the Green Deal as one of its key priorities. I think there are 5 priorities. There's a social Europe, there's digital Europe, and but the Green Deal is one of the main priorities of the Portuguese presidency. From Ireland's point of view, I think we're on a journey, if it's safe to say that, Jeffrey. We have come from a pretty bad place. Our former Taoiseach and now Tánaiste, Leo Varadkar, famously described Ireland as a climate laggard. And I think that was fair. It would cause him a little bit of discomfort, and it caused him to be followed around by the phrase for quite a few months, if not years after that. But he was accurate in saying that. So Ireland has to really evolve. And now, I suppose, after the 2020 general election about a year ago, there is a Green minority party within the Irish government, as you know, and a new climate bill was published last year, which is extremely ambitious. And it was a really sore point in the summer when the programme for government was being negotiated, because the Green Party wanted a 7% reduction in carbon emissions every year to 2030, if we had any hope of achieving our targets under the and then what's called the nationally determined contributions that each member state prepares under the Paris Climate Agreement. So that's now stitched into, well, it's been prepared in terms of Irish law. There will be carbon budgeting in Irish law. There are major green energy projects currently being prepared in Ireland, but we're still very far behind. And I would have an anxiety that we will end up fixed with serious fines from the European Commission for not being able to achieve our climate targets. We looked for a free pass 5 or 6 years ago on emissions, and as part of our recovery from the crash and from the recession in 2008 to 2010. But at this stage, Ireland is doing very well economically, notwithstanding the pandemic, and I think we really have to step up. So I'm delighted that we have this climate bill. I think it'll make a huge difference. It promotes as well the local authorities, Jeffrey. I mean, the role of local authorities, I think you'd find in the US, when you were talking to the Texas politician yesterday, a lot of local authorities are doing what the federal government isn't doing, or where the central government isn't doing. And the same is promoted in the climate bill. So we're looking at our Dublin City Council, Galway City Council, and we're expecting them to really play a significant role. And that's emphasized as well. It's not just expecting central government to do all the heavy lifting. But the final thing I'll say about this is it's all very well in theory. But when you get to the actual application of tariffs and charges and costs that will inevitably be delivered and impact on people's lives and livelihoods, that's when we'll see whether the appetite for change is sufficiently deep within the Irish political system to deliver. And you look at, for example, what happened in France with the yellow vests, the Gilets jaunes, which was a massive reaction against a fairly modest environmental levy. It can be very, very difficult to deliver these the changes that are required to achieve our goals. But I think the more embedded it's becoming at European member state level and at Commission level, I think the easier it'll be to achieve those goals.
Yeah, and it's interesting you mentioned Dublin, because maybe there could be a little bit of inspiration there from Lisbon becoming the green capital, and the measures that Lisbon took, which were quite not just cosmetic. I think they were quite sort of look, see, feel, really making a change. So I mean, and I think that there are
just to follow up on that, Jeffrey. Sorry, to got into it, but you're right. Like Lisbon is, does demonstrate and underline the crucial role of cities in delivering this, and local authorities around planning for local authority housing. It's around energy and retrofitting of the housing stock, and it's about transport. And these are all issues that are dealt with at a certain level within cities. And that's why I think the climate bill has to show that, but cities play a crucial role in that. You're absolutely right.
Yes, no, it's interesting, and together with local authorities. So now back to the Portuguese presidency again, and this vision of a green Europe. And this is where you mentioned actually a little bit about some of the synergies between Portugal and Ireland in terms of oceans and seas, development of blue ocean economy, integrated maritime policy and common fisheries policy. And also what was really noted what you said, Barry, was the fact that Portugal focused on implementation as well. So how can you see not synergies between, rather than phrasing it as working together, but synergies between Portugal and Ireland and this shared investment in maritime sustainability? Do you think it can help to make this line of action a reality?
Well, I mean, the ambassador will be better positioned to discuss that. But I will say a general point here, and that is that post-Brexit, Ireland is a little bit, I won't overstate it, but a little bit isolated in the European Union, a little bit. It's a slightly different geometry because of we would have had a very strong alignment with the UK on certain issues, particularly, for example, on justice and home affairs issues, on tax issues, on financial services, a very high level of affinity, and a common law country outside Schengen. So there were a lot of things that we would have shared our homework with the UK on. I won't overstate the geographical isolation, but it does make it difficult for us because most of the alignments in Europe are physical alignments or regional alignments, whether it's the Visegrad on the eastern side, whether it's the Mediterranean alignment that Portugal would be involved in all the way across to Greece and Malta, or the Nordic Baltic countries, and then the central Franco-German engine that drives it, and then Benelux. But so Ireland, where does it fit into all of that? That's a real question that the Irish government started considering in the around 2015, actually, before the Brexit referendum happened. But Brexit really underlined what an urgent issue it was for Ireland. And since then, the development of alliances with other maritime countries like Portugal has been a priority. And we've also tried to develop alignments with the Nordic and Baltic countries and Netherlands that would have a like-minded approach to financial issues in particular. So, but I think there is work that we can do with Portugal and the maritime agenda. When Ireland was successful in becoming a permanent member of the UN Security Council, one of the things we really pushed was our oceans and sustainability around oceans, and it had a particular appeal to island nations throughout the world, and it was part of the campaign. So it's something that I expect to see being delivered at the UN Security Council, and I expect also that Ireland and Portugal will work together on that agenda on the Security Council, but also in the European Commission. So yeah, I think it's a natural alignment between the two countries in the future.
Interesting. Now, I'm going to look to the near future and back to the COVID-19 pandemic. And it was interesting to hear your contributions yesterday in relation to the challenges facing distributions of vaccines to developing countries. But taking into account the impacts of COVID-19, what do you think the EU's main concern should be? Its economic impact or the environmental impact? And how can the EU prioritise its decisions, bearing in mind not only the impacts of the pandemic, but also these long-term goals, important goals, this Green Deal, in terms of establishing sustainability?
Well, it was a fascinating, experiment almost over the last year. If it wasn't so depressing and difficult for all of us to endure, because we saw a massive drop in carbon emissions over the period of the pandemic, and famous satellite images over China, which sort of a heat map of emissions, which dramatically fell in January, February of 2020. And the lack of international travel has impacted on all of that. And it just goes to show that the level of reductions in emissions to get to what we want to do is going to require absolutely enormous change. So in a way, it's been an interesting sociological experiment, sort of a counterfactual. This will show you what you have to do if you really want to get to 2030, if you're properly ambitious around that. But I think also the pandemic, I mean, the big priority for Europe right now, I get phone calls every single day from people telling me that, look, I'm a huge fan of the European Union, but I will go in a march tomorrow against the European Union unless they pick up their game. Now, our problem in Ireland is that the UK is our reference point, and luckily for the UK, they're galloping ahead with the rollout of their vaccination program, but that makes it extremely difficult for Ireland to sell the EU's framework towards the vaccine rollout has been a success. And yet, at the back of my mind is this concern that there is a global issue here, and that is that 10 countries in the world account for, I think, 70% of the vaccine rollout. And Dr. Tedros, who's head of the WHO, has said it shouldn't be about all people in some countries getting the vaccine. It should be about some people in all countries, meaning healthcare workers, the elderly, those with pre-existing conditions, wherever you might find them. Now, sadly, while the European Union has really stepped up with financial contributions to the COVAX global vaccine agreement, it looks like to get to a position where more than half of the people in some low-income countries will be vaccinated, it'll take late 2023 and possibly into 2024. Now, Dr. Mike Ryan, who's the Irish guy, who's the one of the leaders in the WHO, has said this better than anybody. I mean, you should go and see the video that was circulated by Trokra, where he he really described the moral hazard for all of us. That how will history look at this? But it's not just a moral question, because, as you say, there are economic impacts that are massive for the developing world, and the Sustainable Development Goals have been put back by many years. The normal immunization programs have been put back by many years. The numbers of people in poverty is expected to increase. We've lost a huge amount of the progress that has gone on. And it's also a question of enlightened self-interest, because variance will emerge the longer it goes on. It's a bit of a cliche. We're not, none of us are safe until all of us are safe. But the current rollout doesn't indicate that there is a massive political appetite to achieve this. Now, to the credit of the Portuguese presidency and the Portuguese government, they have committed to distribution of 5% of their own vaccine allocation to developing countries, the Portuguese-speaking developing countries. And that's a good example of leadership. And it's not about, sharing everything we have. It's sharing some of what we have. And we will, I've been on a lot of calls with African civil society groups over the last month. And, the attitude to Europe is pretty negative. We've a long way to go to make up. We are in danger of losing a lot of momentum in the EU-Africa relationship, particularly. And I think therefore that we really need to reset. And as we have our first obligation is to vaccinate our population, but it's not necessarily an either or. We need to do both at the same time. And it's very much an Irish approach. You should listen to Mike Ryan talking about it. He's really quite excellent.
Yeah, it's certainly, because it's a global issue essentially, so we can't ignore that at all. No, we spoke a little bit yesterday about sustainable corporate governance, and I read a paper that you contributed to in that respect, which was extremely interesting. And we mentioned yesterday how legislation and trade policy can work together to achieve this, and also we mentioned actually the shift from shareholder to stakeholder values. Do you want to maybe just share a little bit more about that, Barry, and the concept of sustainable corporate governance and how it can be achieved?
Yeah, I mean, it's a little bit esoteric, but if you're a director of a company, it is quite important to think about it, because the purpose of a company is to create shareholder value. That's what you're taught in business school. But in 2019, the Business Roundtable, which comprises the 150 CEOs of all the big blue chip companies, Apple, Amazon, Microsoft, they all got together and they signed this commitment that the purpose of a company would not just be about shareholder value, but also about, as you say, stakeholder value. So that was interesting, and a lot of people are skeptical, saying, well, this is a little bit of greenwashing, or it's a little bit of PR, and it is meant to inoculate some of these companies from some of the of their faults. So the European Commission decided to go down this road a little bit further, and legislation has now been prepared on the issue of sustainable corporate governance. And what it's trying to address is to try to require boards of directors to think not just in terms of short-term strategy, but to try and think of medium-term strategy and sustainability, and that it would have to report against sustainable goals within their strategy. And it is a complement to the non-financial reporting directive, which is soon to be updated as well. So what it will mean, in fact, is that when companies prepare their strategies and they think about what they're doing and how they're going about their business, they will have to report against these targets, and I think it can be a real game changer. Let's see if private companies are really prepared to change their strategies so that it's not just about economic impact, it's also about social impact. And some companies are doing this really well. Just to give you a quick example, in the insurance industry, for example, if you're a health insurance company, then it's in your interests economically that people are healthier. because they won't be making claims. So that's a social impact and an economic impact. It's a simple, pretty obvious thing. But if you make that a requirement of the way that businesses prepare and think about it, it's not, so their attitude to a lot of companies is charity. You know, whatever we have left over after net profits, we will contribute to a cause. But if it's part of the core strategy and it is around the table when the C-suite are meeting, then it's a game changer, I think, in terms of social impact. And so I have a small role in developing this sustainable corporate governance legislation when it comes before the Parliament or the Commission make the take the initiative on this, and I'm very much looking forward to it. And and then there's a due diligence legislation as well, where companies will have to carefully examine their supply chain to make sure that the way that they procure supplies into their for their own value chains, it doesn't offend against human rights principles, it doesn't offend against sustainability principles or labor rights. So the two of those will go hand in hand. Didier Reynders is the commissioner dealing with that, and we'll see that, I'd say, towards the summer or maybe into the autumn.
No, it's interesting because companies can make a change, and you know, we saw that even in the previous US administration, is the fact that, you know, many companies were leading a more sustainable agenda from the private sector, and the fact that actually legislation is going to come into play whereby there will be responsibilities placed on companies. I can't see it for me. It's an essential, almost an essential move in terms of being able to pursue these goals successfully, Barry.
And it's a little bit around a level playing field, Jeffrey, because, you know, there are a lot of companies, as you say, are already down the road, and are they putting themselves at a disadvantage to those who are not inclined? And the demand, as you say, it's coming from employees, it's coming from shareholders, activist shareholders, it's coming from directors anyway, people of a certain generation who want to see these changes happening. So I think it's a really good time, together with all the stuff we talked about earlier in terms of the new Green Deal, to really drive this agenda in the private sector and let the private sector play its role in this area.
But it is interesting to see the private sector react, if you like, to like a consensus, a green consensus, if you like, if you want to call it that, you know, coming from stakeholders, as you said. But
there's a lot of skepticism about it, Jeffrey. You know, there's a huge amount of people in the development sector who are very skeptical about the role of the private sector, and you know, they're very skeptical about the role of private sector investment and what its real purpose is.
Yeah.
So you know, we'll put some corners on it, and we'll have a really good debate on this when the legislation is proposed next year, or later this year, I should say.
Okay, well, I think that perhaps we may have, let me see if we have any questions. So we have one from Paul Ferns, who's raised the question, Barry, that technology is a significant driver for driving down carbon emissions. Europe doesn't have a Silicon Valley. Do you see one emerging? And if so, where?
Well, it's, you know, last week, was it even this week? There's two Irish guys set up this company called Stripe, and it's now one of the most valued at sort of close to 100 billion euro or dollars, but it's in Silicon Valley. And you know, there's obviously something, we're missing a trick here, why they couldn't set it up in Europe. The first inclination of these guys are very bright, and they have a very good project. They have a good startup idea about 10 years ago, and off they go to Silicon Valley, and there isn't any sense of that opportunities exist either in the UK or in continental Europe, much less in Ireland. So that's why there's an industrial policy being prepared, because there is a hope that we can try to address that issue. And technology has, as you say, it's such a crucial role to play. And we have a foreign direct and foreign subsidies legislation being prepared, but also protecting against investment which might be acquiring European assets and European startups by China and other places, that is really crucial to protecting the possibility of a European Silicon Valley. So it'll be interesting to see how that industrial policy contributes to that, but I think, you know, we just don't have the capital markets here, and Brexit has had a very negative impact there, because most of the capital markets are based out of London, and we've lost that fluidity of cross-border investment that was beginning to emerge. But Mairead McGuinness is now the commissioner with responsibility to deliver the Capital Markets Union, and that'll be really important way to bring energy into that area. And I think, but I don't think protectionism is the solution whatsoever. So we will look at it in industrial policy with great caution. We you know, trying to create barriers to trade in order to protect EU startups is not the solution. There's almost no example in history, going back centuries, where protection has driven innovation. You need a more global approach to innovation, but you also need to have the capital and the investment and the certainty that your investments will be protected in order to create that type of innovation. So some very interesting moving parts, and it's you know, but I think Mairead McGuinness has a crucial role to play in all of this in the next few years.
Yeah, and I think Portugal is trying to do its bit in terms of attracting startups and this sort of making an attractive environment in order to invest. But yes, there may well be a bit to go. I just wanted to maybe flip back a little bit to carbon emissions, and effectively you supported last year the 60% overall reduction in the carbon emissions by 2030. And I know you've already mentioned the climate law within Ireland itself, but specifically, do you see any difficulties being caused by this in Ireland, and whether in fact I suppose the current draft law is aligned with that, or whether there are other things that need to be done in order to seek to achieve this goal?
Yeah, it's going to be very difficult. Now, there is a just transition fund in place to try to make sure that there is you know, that we don't have damage to people's lives and livelihoods as a result of the transitions that are required, and that's an important safety net. But just to give a personal account of it, Jeffrey, my grandfather was was the first managing director of Bord na Móna, which set up the cultivation production of turf in Ireland before the Second World War. And it was crucial to, as an alternative to supplies of coal from the UK, where there, obviously with the war effort, it was crucial that was developed. And it also created a huge amount of jobs in the Midlands in Ireland. But that's obviously slowly being unwound right now. And there are generations and communities that benefited from Bord na Móna and the jobs it created in areas where there was almost no industrial production of any sort. So right now it's a really live issue. How do we transition out of electricity produced by turf and indeed by coal? And it's even a big issue, a much bigger issue in Central and Eastern Europe. So there is a Just Transition Fund worth 17 billion euro, which is there to try to provide alternative training and opportunities. Now, Ireland is pretty well placed in terms of our fantastic foreign direct investment record in bringing manufacturing into Ireland in the pharmaceutical area, in the chemicals area, but even in the services area around tech. So we have the opportunities for a just transition, but I think the issue will be much more, a much bigger issue in Central and Eastern Europe, where the reliance on coal-fired electricity power stations is much greater. But it is, I think, a great opportunity. And as again, if we're serious about this, we have to face up to these realities. But communicating that will be critical, and the political will and driving that will be critical to achieving those aims.
Yes. Now we have another question, I believe. Just going to try and pop it up, which is and this is yes, this is a question which is the EU plan for resilience and recovery voted last year a good opportunity to push the sustainability development and agenda in Europe?
Yeah, I think so. I think the RRF has as I mentioned earlier, 37% of it has to be applied to the sustainability agenda. So what's happening right now is that each of the member states are coming up with what's called national recovery plans. They have to be submitted in April. And so at the moment in Ireland, for example, the Department of Public Expenditure and Reform is going to the various other government departments, going to the city councils in certain cases, and asking for ideas. And the fund will be worth about €1 billion to Ireland, a little bit less. And it will be it'll be a balance between grants and loans, and it will be tried to encourage investment in sustainability and sustainable development in Ireland. So the RRF is absolutely geared towards that, and it's a minimum of 37%. So it's not it's something that I think will really drive change. And I've had discussions, for example, with Dublin City Council about their submission to the National Recovery Plan, which in turn will be submitted to the Commission in April by the Department of Public Expenditure and Reform, and that's happening across all of the member states right now. So the RRF is it's a really extraordinary thing. People referred to it as Europe's Hamilton moment. Now, if you're into Broadway musicals, or if you're into American history, you'll know that Alexander Hamilton created the idea for the 13 US colonies that they would mutualize their debt. So they'd share the debt that had risen from the wars of independence, and it was a massive game changer. And he was the first Treasury Secretary under Washington. So now the European Union is setting up this RRF, which is again mutualized debt across all of the member states under a European framework, and trying to drive the recovery, but against the priorities of the digital transition and the new Green Deal. So the question then for the European Union is, when this elapses in 2027, do we do it again? So is this here to stay? That's a big issue. There's a lot of the Dutch and others who would be anxious that this would only be a temporary measure, because they say, look, we keep our house very well in order, and then there are other countries who don't, and we're having to pick up the pieces for them. We pay high taxes, high personal taxes and local taxes, and we fund services within our countries. Why should we then have another fiscal obligation created by Europe that just because others are laggards essentially? So, but the RRF I think is a game changer for a lot of reasons, and it's a really incredible how. And by the way, I think the Parliament has really driven this agenda, but how the pandemic has been a crisis that's created an opportunity, and the opportunity to build back better within Europe over the next few years.
Yes. Now, we did talk as well about implementation, and implementation being one of the focuses of the Portuguese presidency. Other than what we've already discussed, Barry, certainly looking at things of sustainability issues, what specific challenges do you see in that implementation? We saw yesterday, we heard yesterday in Ballymun that there were a series of challenges which were faced from an implementation perspective of environmental policy, if you like. Do you kind of see anything, or can you give us any insight into, during Portugal's term, whether there are specific challenges which it needs to address in terms of implementation?
Yeah, definitely. The Portuguese presidency is focused on a social Europe, which means safety nets and trying to make sure that we create job opportunities for younger people. And so there's a summit coming up in May, and in Lisbon. Well, it's probably it's obviously going to be a virtual summit, but it's been hosted by the Portuguese presidency. And my own group has been kind of preparing submissions to this social Europe agenda. Now, the last one was back in 2017, and it was held in Gothenburg under the Swedish presidency. And the general attitude of member states on the European Council was, look, hang on a second, that's all very well in theory, but we pay our taxes. The Dutch attitude that we really aren't interested in having minimum wage at a European level, or any of these sort of universal basic income. It's just not going to happen. This is a member state competence, You cannot acquire powers into the European Union. So if you ask the question, what is the challenge for implementation? That's where the challenge will be. It'll be at the European Council level, where member states are not inclined to see the Commission acquiring powers. And I think that's the first area that Portugal will really have. If anybody's interested in European politics and the way it works, be really interested to watch the preparation for that social summit, what the conclusions look like, who has given what, if there are any real changes that can be anticipated, or whether it's more language and words and no action. So I'm looking forward to seeing how much the Portuguese are able to achieve. But I mean, they have set their the motto for their presidency is time to deliver a fair, green and digital economy. So the fairness is about the even distribution of the benefits of globalization and trade, and obviously the digital and green agendas we've talked about already.
Yes, and it'll be interesting to see how it plays out the virtual conference as well, because that presumably will be the first time it happens. And there we can see, obviously, technology has been a fundamental part about continuing to run policies and change policies using virtual platforms. So it'll be interesting to see how the lack of sort of physical contact, if you like, is going to change or affect any change that can actually be made during that conference, or whether, as you say, it will just be conversations more than anything else.
Yeah, well, I think the virtual work has been a real challenge for all of us. We've been able to do a lot more. As the ambassador said, I used to work for the think tank in Dublin, and we wanted to get a speaker over, let's say Mr. Barroso or some other luminary. He would have to carve out a day and a half to get there, to give his speech, to get back, and you'd be booking hotels. But now you can have these events with high-level speakers sharing ideas and hopefully shaping policy in a much easier fashion. But the downside of all of that, I think, is experienced by children, kids in education. There's a lot of studies now emerging that this whole online, seeing yourself on a screen all the time, is a real stress for children. So, and I think probably a little bit for adults too. So the sooner we get back to meeting and being able to rub shoulders in corridors and having those discussions on the margins of summit meetings, I think it'll be great. But at the same time, it's amazing what we have achieved under these circumstances over the last 12 months in the European institution. I know there's a lot of criticism around the vaccine rollout, but a huge amount has been achieved. I hope I've sort of touched on some of those things as we've gone through this conversation this morning.
Absolutely, Barry. I suppose just to wrap up, I'm just going to flip back and see if we've got any further questions. I think we've covered. I do invite anyone to pop up any last minute questions. And maybe I'm just maybe not an entirely fair question, Barry, but looking on the sort of next 20 years, let's say, let's move or next 30 actually. Let's move towards like 2050. And in terms of the Green Deal, what do you really see as the achievables in terms of goals during that period of time?
Wow, well, it's a huge question. I mean, you've got to.
sorry.
Yeah, it's a huge question. No, it's fine, Jeffrey. I mean, look, we're not blind to these things. We do have to take a long-term view, and we do have to take a geopolitical view. And you almost all conversations about geopolitical strategies start with, well, it's great that Biden is the president because we can go back to multilateralism on climate and migration, on world health, on trade. We can go back to multilateralism, and Europe and the United States have an affinity because of rule of law, commitment to democracy and human rights, and that seems to us to be a natural geopolitical vector for achieving our ambitions on climate, digital, et cetera, et cetera. And it's interesting that the European Commission proposed in December this Trade and Technology Council between the US and the EU, almost immediately after the presidential election, before Biden had got into the Oval Office. But then you have China, and China is getting on with it, frankly. And there's a new trading arrangement called RCEP, the Regional comprehensive economic partnership, which is 15 countries, the ASEAN countries, plus China, plus Japan, plus Australia and New Zealand. And this is the first time that China and Japan have had a trade deal. It's the first time that China and South Korea have had a trade deal. And they have a permanent secretariat. So they're ambitious to create, we call the Brussels effect of standards and regulation. Their ambition is to create their own standards for regional trade in Asia. So I think that we will see that gravitational pull of China being much greater. And we then have to strike that balance we were talking about earlier. China is an autocracy. That's the way it is. There are serious issues about the Uyghur population in Xinjiang, about the democracy activists in Hong Kong. And should we now have a proposed comprehensive agreement on investment with China. So do we continue as if nothing happened? And that's a challenge for Europe. But I think the green agenda will shape politics. I think it will shape conflict to a certain extent. And the Sustainable Development Goals sit in front of us for 2030. 17 goals that were set out 5-6 years ago. We're very much backsliding on that. So that needs a recharge. But look, it's a huge question, Jeffrey. I can only suggest, they're the headline items that are on people's minds as we talk about those things.
No, I appreciate you answering it, Barry. So we do have one final, I'm conscious of your time, but we do have one final question, which is coming from Christina Ravich. Looking at the broader definitions of sustainability, including biodiversity, both Ireland and Portugal have massive natural resources that we need to treasure and preserve, plus extensive degraded ecosystems that need restoration. Have you any views on this?
Well, there is a file on biodiversity that our trade committee are dealing with right now. So again, trade is the external expression of our internal market. And the Renew group that I'm a member of is very anxious to make sure that we stitch into all of our trade agreements what are called trade and sustainable development chapters. Not only are there chapters about trade and sustainable development, but there are enforceable and sanctions-based enforcements. Now that hasn't been finally settled, but what it means, for example, let's take the case of Mercosur, which combines the 4 countries of Brazil, Argentina, Uruguay, and I think Paraguay. And there's environmental degradation is standing in the way of achieving, of finally ratifying the EU Mercosur trade agreement. So it's that dilemma that you face. Well, if we don't do the agreement on trade with Brazil and the other Mercosur countries, what leverage do we have over them? We're still going to trade with them. They're still going to degrade the Amazon and clear forests for soybeans and palm oil and all of that. We know all of that is going to happen. So why wouldn't it be better to have a trade agreement with them so that we can hold them to their obligations? They are signatories of the Paris Climate Agreement, after all. And this is perhaps the best way to achieve these things. So, but biodiversity is at the core of this. It's at the core of the health issues of zoonotic diseases. So you lose biodiversity, you have sort of that is what is leading to much greater viruses jumping into the human population. So it's not just a green agenda anymore. It's not just an esoteric environmentalists issue. It's very mainstream now. It's mainstream in trade. It's mainstream in health, and it's now, I think, the central bank is looking at environmental degradation as a real systemic risk to the economic system upon which the European Union delivers prosperity for its citizens. So these issues are no longer on the periphery of political discussion. They are very much in the center of political discussion, Jeffrey. So I hope that answers the question there a little bit, hopefully.
It does, and it's a positive note to conclude on. in the sense of the positioning of these issues as central and fundamental issues moving forward. Well, look, I mean, it's been a fascinating insight, Barry, both not only from a European scale, but also from a global scale on the whole issue of sustainability. We covered a heck of a lot of ground, really, in 1 hour, and probably not with the depth which perhaps we would have liked, but at the same time, it's been very insightful to actually earmark a number of the issues, as part of the Green Deal and the sustainability agenda. So I just really want to thank you for your time and the effort you've put into this, sharing your views and insights with the network, which has been invaluable. It's proved to be a really nice contribution to the whole conference itself, and a very focused and fundamental one. So thank you, Barry, and also I wish you an extremely happy St. Patrick's Day.
Yeah, and to you, Jeffrey, and to everybody in the network, thanks for the opportunity. It's really great to have the discussion, Jeffrey. You're very incisive questions. So if Newsnight are ever looking for somebody to fill the slot there, you're the man. But look, happy St. Patrick's Day to you and everybody. Keep safe. And as I said at the beginning, I hope that next year we'll all be back to seeing our loved ones on these special days in the normal way.
Let's hope so, Barry. And thanks.